determinant factor in understanding why the situation with guns and arms exists in Mexico right now. It's a long-standing historical relationship, and it has a lot to do with the United States treating Mexico not really as an ally, not the kind of ally that it had in nationalist China against communists, but the relationship between the United States and Mexico is actually one of animosity. And the United States is not treating Mexico as an ally, but as a potential threat. And the gun and arms smuggling that goes on in Mexico has to be viewed in the context of the United States government trying to destabilize Mexico, which is what it's always been trying to do. And it's been trying to do this since World War I. Even before World War I, it's been trying to do it since the 19th century when Mexico made slavery illegal. And American slaves were escaping into Mexico. And the southern states saw this as an act of war against the Confederacy of the southern states. And they would conduct raids into Mexico to get their slaves back. And Mexico would give the slaves refuge, So there was lots of tension going on. And of course, there's a big dose of racism that's involved as a result of this. Mexicans are considered no better than Black Americans in the sense of being inferior. They're uneducated, they're poor, they're all these things that nationalist Americans hate and despise and consider un-American. So that's a big element. But ever since the 19th century, U.S. policy has been to destabilize Mexico. And in World War I and World War II, this advanced because Mexico entered into relationships with Germany. And there's the famous Zimmerman letter. And the United States has always suspected that Mexico, with its vastly undernourished and impoverished population, harbors communist sympathies. And it does everything it can to prop up the elite there and to help it brutalize the lower classes and keep them impoverished and unable to organize themselves politically and economically. And that helps the United States. It destabilizes Mexico so that even if they were to join with the Castro-Cuban clique that is now on the ascendancy in Latin America, with the Organization of American States, for example, defending Ecuador, and it's giving Julian Assange refuge. They're speaking out against Yankee imperialism with a collective voice that has a lot to do with the teachings and the motivations of Castro. And then there's always the fear that Mexico, which borders the United States, the old Reagan, it's in our backyard cliche, that Mexico could go that way too. So what you have to understand is that the United States, in its covert arms and drug activities in Mexico, is trying to destabilize that government. And it's been selling arms to revolutionary forces in Mexico since the 19th century, supporting rebellions in the provinces against the central government in order to keep it destabilized. And all these drug and gun things that you're seeing have this political and economic motivation to them. That's the context you have to see these things in.
Wow. So, if we take this back to how this is being presented to the public, it seems to be some kind of gun sting operation that went awry. that's all that's getting out to people. It's just amazing. And it'll be interesting to see. There's a story that we put up on Brass Check that came out of a local Fox station, surprisingly enough, and that's where this information about the Sinaloa cartel being actively supported by the U.S. And supposedly the goal, according to this man's attorney, of this support is the U.S. is trying to create a mega cartel, get rid of all the little small players so that there's just one unified cartel down in Mexico. Did that make sense in some way based on your experience of watching how these things unfold?
Since 1973, the CIA has been in control of narcotic intelligence worldwide and within the United States. The function in 1973 was taken away from the DEA and given to the CIA, which is the unseen hand in this drama that's playing out supposedly about the ATF and the DEA. And they're actually just minor players in this drama who traditionally, as law enforcement agencies, are shoved up in front of the CIA. But it's the CIA and the State Department that are arranging what's happening down in Mexico. because basically law enforcement agencies like the DEA and ATF have no final say in matters that happen in Mexico. The State Department has concerns about political relationships in Mexico that trump any law enforcement concerns. And anytime a law enforcement operation is conducted in a foreign country, it has to be approved by the State Department. It has to be approved by the CIA. The CIA controls all the informant checks on anybody that's being recruited by a law enforcement agency in Mexico. If I'm in the DEA and I want to recruit the Sinaloa or any other cartel in Mexico or somebody from them, I have to check with the CIA. They run a background check to find out whether this guy's working for the Russians or the German, because we're always concerned mostly that the Mexicans are going to be working for our enemies. The Iranians, Hezbollah, you always hear about Hezbollah in Mexico. So the CIA has control over all the informants that are recruited by the DEA and the ATF in Mexico. And the media knows this. Every reporter who works there knows this. But they're not telling you that, because if they were to tell you that, they would be accused, like Bradley Manning, of aiding the enemy, because they're telling you national security secrets. So the media is prevented from mentioning the work that the State Department and the CIA play on these little melodramas that you see, that are, the script is written by politicians in the White House on behalf of the CIA and the State Department to cover up their political and economic activities, and blamed on these law enforcement organizations, DEA and ATF, which are really just spear carriers. There are people in the background of these operations who are doing the bidding of their masters in the CIA and the State Department. So the view that people have of these operations is totally skewed. The CIA, whatever its purposes in dealing with this informant or that informant, have nothing at all to do with law enforcement, because they're not law enforcement agencies. And the State Department doesn't care about who has guns and who has drugs. And so it's totally corrupt. And the view that we have is totally skewed. Whatever their CIA and State Department motivations and intentions are, other than in the big picture, which I can tell you, I don't know what their individual specific intentions are, which politician in Mexico they're backing through these activities, which industrialists in Mexico they're backing through these activities, gun and drug activities. But that's what it's about. It's about the CIA and the State Department backing particular politicians who can enact policies that are helpful to the United States and national security issues, and industrialists who are able to suppress the Mexican people and help industrialists in the United States make billions of dollars. Those are the motivations behind who the CIA selects as an informant in which cartel. Nothing at all to do with drug law enforcement.
So the ATF, the FBI, these are the fall guys.
The FBI is not a fall guy. The FBI is also a national security agency. Its national security function is internal security. The CIA's object is not internal security. Its object is making foreign countries, foreign nations, abide by American policy. The FBI is more of protecting the United States from any foreign influence. So the FBI is in the mix just to make sure that nobody in Mexico is trying to interfere in American politics or make political decisions or economic decisions that are contrary to what the bosses want. It's that simple. Although you'll never hear it in the news. They don't even talk about the FBI in the news. I mean, when do you ever read an article in the news about the CIA or the FBI or the State Department and what it's doing on a daily basis, other than to hear Hillary Clinton say, we're going to rape and murder Gaddafi today, and then tomorrow we're going to rape and murder Assad. And that's all you ever hear.
And then she's on her, whirlwind tour of the world. That's the other thing that we do here. She's here today. She's there tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's deflecting attention from real issues.
But we could talk about so many things today, but I think we've covered the background, the historical background that'll give people some perspective on what's going on in this story of Gun Runner or Fast and Furious. It's amazing to me how skillful they are at keeping the focus on, I'm not going to say trivia, but keeping the focus on a tiny part of the story and just not even getting into what the real story is. And it's also interesting how they mix operations. For example, I believe there's a strong desire to make it difficult, if not impossible, for private citizens to own guns in the United States. So they're getting an extra bonus out of this whole story, or they were trying to get a bonus by saying, hey, 90% of the guns in Mexico come from the U.S. In fact, there are videos floating around out there where you see that Hillary Clinton and Obama and every other politician you can imagine, Chuck Schumer, for example, they're all stating this number, 90% of all guns in Mexico in the hands of the cartels come from the U.S., which of course is ridiculous. The U.S. left thousands and thousands and thousands of military-grade weapons in Central America and then just abandoned them in warehouses. And those are all over the place now. And certainly if you're a drug cartel, you can buy guns from Switzerland or Belgium or Israel or whoever you want. So it's just interesting that in addition to this larger mission of keeping Mexico in check, they're also saying, hey, why don't we use this as a way to make something happen locally, domestically.
Let me pick up on that domestic thread. The politics and economics of guns and drugs in the United States is half of this equation. And it, again, has to do with politics and economics more than guns and drugs. Right now, the United States has 5% of the world's population and has 25% of the world's prisoners. Most of those prisoners are in jail, in prison, for drug-related offenses. No other country on planet Earth has the zero-tolerance drug laws that the United States has. Most countries, you get arrested for drugs, you go to jail for 3 weeks and you're out. So I don't do it again. It's a consensual crime between the seller and the user. It has no effect on anybody else. Even Hoover and the FBI used to say he wanted nothing at all to do with drug law enforcement because it's a consensual crime like gambling. It's seen as a moral issue. It undermines Christian values, whatever the hell those are. It doesn't hurt anybody but the person who consumes the drugs himself, assuming that person's getting harmed at all to begin with. So America has created this whole vast prison industry, which is largely privatized and which props up a huge law enforcement presence in the United States, which would not normally be in accordance with American principles of freedom. But the drug propaganda machine has succeeded in demonizing the minorities, make up the vast majority of people in prison for drug offenses. And the drug industry itself channels a large portion of the drugs that come into this country to disenfranchised minorities who get arrested and imprisoned at a much higher rate than white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who by and large can afford attorneys and don't get convicted in a summary manner because they can get a lawyer and the courts don't want to have to spend the time going to trial. The disenfranchised minorities that are arrested for drug offenses can't afford lawyers and they cop pleas and they go to prison. And it builds up this great prison industry which funnels a lot of money into American industrialists, and it provides the pretext for having a huge law enforcement presence in the United States, which makes it easier to surveil everybody and control everybody, because for the last 70, 75 years, even longer, drug law enforcement and arms law enforcement have been methods to politically and through the systematic subversion of the justice system control Americans. Politically control Americans and control through the hammer of institutionalized terror. And that's the domestic end of this drug and arms boondoggle.